This is your reminder that the BBC has yet to address the consistent transphobic leanings in its news coverage, and while the team behind Doctor Who is not connected to this in any way since this is a BBC-owned property, I'm going to keep pointing it out until the problem gets resolved. Links in a pinned comment below if you don't know what I'm talking about. I'll stop saying it when it stops being a problem.
Doctor Who has its ups and downs, but whenever somebody tries to claim it's currently the worst it's ever been, I can only shake my head and laugh. Oh no, Summer Child. Let me tell you the story of the true worst episode ever. Are you sitting comfortably? Then we'll begin. Whenever there's a new season of Doctor Who, there are inevitably some folks out there prepared to call it a new low point for the franchise and declare some particular episode as the worst episode of Doctor Who. I've been watching the show as it aired since Series 4, so I've heard most of this as it has happened. The Doctor's Daughter is the worst episode of Doctor Who. The Lodger is the worst episode of Doctor Who. Let's Kill Hitler. The Power of Three, Kill the Moon, Sleep No More, The Lie of the Land, Arachnids in the UK, Orphan 55, Survivors of the Flux, Space Babies. All of these and more I've seen called the worst episode of Doctor Who. It's a cycle. It's as inevitable as the tides, and it happens pretty much completely independently of the actual quality of any given season or even episode. For me, though, the most frustrating thing about fans and pundits asking, does this new episode suck? Is this the worst episode ever? And all of that, besides, the needless hyperbole, is the simple fact that we already had the worst episode of Doctor Who ever. And it came out nearly 2 decades ago. And the overriding reason for it being the worst episode is why I have some confidence that it'll never be topped for badness. Because Love and Monsters may botch its tone, The Timeless Child may upend canon, reverse a previous major victory, then do absolutely nothing with either of those things. The Wedding of River Song may be a self-indulgent disaster, and the Battle of Ranskorav Kolos may be the least competently written thing carrying the show's name from any standard of either plot or structure, but no amount of wonky effects, silly ideas, or bizarre character turns will ever result in something that at its core is completely morally abhorrent. Except for the Idiot's Lantern. Regulars to this channel have probably heard me say all this before, but up until now it's been in unscripted videos. A review, various lists, but as we live in an age of perpetual worst episode ever discourse, I'm gonna plant my flag in this hill because I have every intention of dying on it. So I want to go through this in detail, which does mean that I won't be focusing exclusively on the absolute moral train wreck that is the episode's ending, because while that may very much be the worst of its sins, it's far from being the only thing wrong with it. And in the interest of fairness, I'll be noting a few things that I do think are genuinely good about this episode, even though those things don't stay good across the runtime or get completely smothered by what's bad about it. But I'm going to try, at least, to be fair. The Idiot's Lantern aired on May 27, 2006. It features David Tennant as the 10th Doctor, accompanied by Billie Piper as companion Rose Tyler, and deals with the two of them arriving in North London in 1953 as the company is preparing for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Wacky Doctor Who-style hijinks featuring an electronic being taking over television signals to steal people's faces ensues. The episode was directed by Euros Lyn and written by Mark Gatiss. Lyn has a mixed bag of episodes to his name as a director. On the one hand, having directed fan favorites such as the Library two-parter from Series 4, and on the other hand, having directed episodes such as the notoriously poor Fear Her from Series 2. While Lyn has never really blown me away as a director, he seems to be perfectly competent so long as he's working with a decent script. And the subject of the script brings us to Mark Gatiss. I won't lie, I always feel a little bit bad talking about Gatiss' work on Doctor Who. The thing is, he clearly has an incredibly deep love of the show, and I adore his passion, and actually, I rather enjoy him as an actor as well. However, very few of the 9 episodes he's written to date do much for me at all. Given his tendency to indulge in aspects of Doctor Who that just aren't my preference, I've largely chalked it up to the notion that he just loves different things about the show than I do. And to be clear, that is okay. But to break it down a little bit, 7 of the 9 scripts he's written feature historical settings, which on their own tend to be a bit of a sticking point for me for a number of reasons. The short version is that I don't have an inherent problem with historical episodes, but the show does tend to indulge in things I just don't really care for whenever it does them. The big one tends to be the aggrandizing and often moral simplifying of major historical figures, such as, say, Winston Churchill. The only one of Gatiss' episodes that I genuinely love is Robot of Sherwood, which had the luxury of being about folklore figures rather than historical figures who are actually confirmed to be real. And the episode also features some just outright stellar banter as a bonus. The only other one of his that mostly works for me is Cold War, which again doesn't pick out any specific real-world figures and instead just plays with its time setting. That having been said, while I don't really care for Gatiss' work on Doctor Who, he's not an innately bad writer. One can look at the film covering the creation of Doctor Who titled An Adventure in Space and Time, which Gatiss wrote the script for, and that script is stellar. So while I don't usually love Gatiss' work, even grading on that scale, my disgust for Idiot's Lantern is an outlier, because mostly Gatiss just tends to bore me a bit. But the Idiot's Lantern, it isn't boring. Oh, if only. But let's start at the beginning, because when things start, it's not too bad. We open on a rainy, thundering night at Magpie's Electronicals in London, 1953. We see the eponymous owner going through his accounting books with an air of defeat, as a TV flickering behind him announces the end of the day's programming. We cut to the Connolly home and meet the family who will serve as the secondary cast for the episode. That's Mother Rita, son Tommy, and Grandma, all together in the living room. Enter Father Eddie, decked out in a chest worth of military honors and announcing that he's going out for the night and not to wait up for him. Tommy pesters his father about getting a television, to which Eddie seems resistant but not completely opposed. Back at Magpie's, a suspiciously red-tinged lightning bolt hits the antenna, and inside the building, the TV springs to life and addresses the owner directly. Magpie assumes he's dreaming, but soon learns he isn't as electrical tendrils grab at his face as the figure on the TV laughs. Alright, let's be clear. This is a pretty dang good opening. It establishes time, place, supporting cast, villain, and atmosphere all in less than 2.5 minutes. And right out of the gate, Maureen Lipman, as the woman on the TV, who we will come to know as The Wire, is pitch perfect casting. I am just going to quickly mention here that Lipman is someone who I don't agree with on, well, a lot of things, and I don't want any praise I might have for her performance to be taken as an endorsement of her or her views, but fair's fair. She's amazing in what she's doing here. She has the perfectly affected posh delivery, and there's just an exquisite sinister undertone to lines like,
"Are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin."
She pitches just to the level where it sounds authentic to the era of television, but also works as a flat-out threat. Following the credits, we get the arrival of the TARDIS and the emergence of our leads. The Doctor does his hair up a bit, and Rose has a whole new outfit to match where they initially think they've landed.
If you want to see Elvis, you go for the late 50s. Time before burgers.
That being an Elvis performance in the late 50s. I've always just liked when the Doctor and the companion adjust their looks for a time period. I don't need it in every historical episode, but I do just enjoy that. So, again, this opening is pretty good. We return to the Connolly home as Eddie, Rita, and Tommy watch their brand new television. Grandma is conspicuously absent, and while Eddie is ecstatic about the TV, Rita and Tommy are visibly upset. Something has happened to Grandma, and not only does Eddie not want to talk about it, he tries to insist that Rita give him a smile. And when she won't, he shouts her down, even as they hear what's presumed to be Grandma fumbling about in the room above them. Now, as I go over this, I'm not going to cover every single scene of the episode in high detail, but if you hadn't noticed already, I am going to be bringing special attention to pretty much every scene of the Connolly home. If you don't already know why I'm doing this, you will by the time we're done. The Doctor and Rose run into Mr. Magpie selling preposterously cheap televisions to ensure the entire neighborhood will be able to watch the coronation of the Queen. But when a neighbor of the Connollys is suddenly bundled out of his house by two men in black suits against the pleas of his wife while being covered in a blanket to conceal his head and face, well, the Doctor and Rose know that something is up. This is also where they meet Tommy, who says it's been happening up and down the street, before Eddie emerges to bellow him into silence. We check in on Magpie and the face on the TV. We learn that he's helping her with little more than a vague hope that after all of this, she'll leave him alone, making him a victim of this villain rather than a willing conspirator. She is still absolutely nailing the evil under the surface of tea time banality.
We'll see. If you're a very good boy.
Back at the Connolly house, Tommy ventures upstairs rather nervously, intending to unlock the room his grandmother's being held in, but Eddie arrives and intimidates Tommy into giving him the key before laying into him when they're back downstairs. Eddie berates the boy in front of Rita and refuses to let him get a word in.
Excuse me, sunshine, I am talking.
And then, after an extremely token play at comforting Rita about her mother, he shouts her down too. Note that the second time he bellows, "I am talking!" Rita didn't actually interrupt him. All she did was try and change the subject to something he did not want to talk about. So this is where we need to pause and talk about Eddie Connolly as a character. And what I mean by that is mostly he isn't one. Not really. He's a caricature, a cartoon, an exaggerated oaf with only one setting. And even before we get into the other issues, that in and of itself is already a problem. Eddie is functionally a secondary villain, but he's also meant to represent a more real-life threat. The insecure patriarch with an overblown sense of national pride who feels obedience is owed to him by all in his home. Except that's all he is. And he's that cranked up to buffoonish levels. Right from the first time I ever talked about this episode, I had people pushing back on this point, telling me some variant of, well, actually, there really were people like that at the time. World War II veterans who took excessive pride in their service and thought that they were owed a better life than what they had and took it out on those around them. And you know what? I'm sure that that's true. There were, without question, men who very much fit the mold that Eddie Connolly represents. The problem is that doesn't make him any less of a cartoonish, shallow character. Having real-world precedent alone doesn't make a character compelling or successful within the narrative that they're being used. I could find you real-life Americans who talk like Jim Varney on Quaaludes and play the banjo when they're not down at the bayou trapping crawfish, and that wouldn't make a character like that any less of a cartoon. Between not having enough time to give the character depth and cranking up his few traits to a near constant 11, Eddie is just a dead weight on the episode. And it already has a cartoonish villain in The Wire. Later on, that dead weight that he represents is going to be part of what sinks this episode into the pit forever. But I am getting ahead of myself. The Doctor and Rose ring the bell, and the Doctor uses Eddie's overblown sense of patriotism to talk their way into the home and trick Eddie into busying himself by hanging up the flag around the house, with Rose jumping in to take the guy down a little extra peg.
Union Jacks?
Yes, that's right, isn't it?
It's the Union Jack only when it's flown at sea.
I do apologise.
Well, don't get it wrong again.
While Eddie fusses with the flag, the Doctor starts in on trying to find out what's been happening. Rita tries to explain, but begins to cry, snapping Eddie out of his daze with the flags to realize he's lost his iron grip on the household.
Queen and country's one thing, but this is my house.
The Doctor's having none of it and stands up not only to Eddie, but in fact, over him.
I am talking!
And I'm not listening!
The reaction from Eddie makes it instantly clear he doesn't know what to do when he can't just shout people into submission? When knocking starts coming from above, Tommy offers what little he knows to the doctor and then takes him upstairs to see his grandmother. This gives us the reveal of what's been happening to people as she appears with a blank wall of flesh where her face should be. Credit where credit's due. This is a creepy image. I'm not entirely sure that a show with Doctor Who's budget fully sells it, but the idea itself is strong enough that it works anyways. While the Doctor tries to get a sense of things, a black car pulls up, signaling the arrival of suited men here to throw a sheet over the grandmother and bundle her off with the apparent approval of Eddie. The Doctor gives chase while Rose stays behind long enough to notice red electrical energy around the TV and to check the back of the set and see that it came from Magpie Electronicals. On my rewatch to work on the script, it did strike me as odd that the Doctor left Rose behind. But I'm not going to dwell on that because, one, it never jumped out at me before, so I'm inclined to give it a pass. I was looking at the thing with extra scrutiny this time. And two, it does fit into the overly cavalier attitude the two of them have and just assuming everything will always be fine, which will have massive consequences down the line in the finale and is arguably part of the series arc. So, yeah, that's fine. The Doctor breaks into the building where the faceless people are being warehoused, while Rose follows the lead to Magpies. There we get the hint of what our villain will eventually devolve into when the woman's face appears on the screen and calls out,
Hungry?
Magpie tries to shoo Rose out of the building, but she's not having it. However, her stubbornness will prove her downfall as the woman begins to speak to her and identifies herself, finally, as the Wire. We see the return of the red electric tendrils that grab hold of Rose's face and appear to suck it off, as Magpie apologizes somewhat weakly. The Doctor, having been caught by the police in the warehouse, finds out the authorities are just as flummoxed as anybody else and don't know what to do besides bundle the affected people out of sight to prevent a panic. While the Doctor and the detective inspector try and find a pattern, a faceless Rose is brought in to be placed with the others. And as one might expect, the Doctor is now pissed.
There is no power on this earth that can stop me.
At the Connolly's home, there's a gathering around the TV as the group prepares to watch the coronation. Of course, while we're here, we get a bit of Eddie exerting his authority over Rita and insisting that she smile. Tommy tries to undermine Eddie just a little bit by suggesting his aunt should go upstairs to see his grandmother. The grandmother he knows is no longer up there. But Eddie diverts the conversation with a put down.
Proper little mummy's boy all round.
And this is followed by an overt threat.
Eddie, you want to beat that out of him?
That's exactly what I'm gonna do.
Now, I've seen a few people suggest that Tommy is intended to be queer-coded, mainly because of this scene.
Oh, you know what they say about them.
As what's being alluded to with that whole mummy's boy thing is that Tommy is liable to be effeminate and therefore gay, which in the 1950s is something that would be encouraged to be beaten out of young boys. Now, while the threat is 100% homophobic in nature, I'm not entirely sure that I agree it's meant to actually reveal an inner truth about Tommy. Queerphobic people don't need someone to actually be queer in order to bully them on that basis. Eddie's latching onto anything he can say to appear in control while semi-publicly threatening his son. That having been said, I also don't want to undermine the experiences of any queer people who saw a troubling moment of their own lives reflected in Tommy's. It's one of those things where I'm not sure I agree with the reading, but I'm also not going to dispute it. Especially because there is actually one other line that could lend some credence to this particular reading. When the bell rings, Tommy takes the opportunity to leave the room and finds the Doctor on the warpath. He doesn't get anything out of Tommy before Eddie appears. He tries to drive off the Doctor and the detective inspector before turning on Tommy and revealing his priorities: respect and what he believes people outside his home think of him. This pushes Tommy enough for him to confront his father outright, starting with the fact that he knows it was Eddie who summoned the police to take away his grandmother. Eddie tries to silence him by citing his military service, but Tommy isn't having it. Now, in the interest of being as fair as possible, I actually asked people who are more inclined to like this episode to tell me what they think is good about it. I asked in my community tab here on YouTube, and I asked on Twitter. And while most of it was stuff that I kind of expected, enjoyment of the setting, banter, 10 and Rose being peak 10 and Rose, etc., it did also end up highlighting a few things I might have otherwise missed. One of them being this moment of Tommy standing up to his father. He pushes back on the idea that Eddie's service in World War II gives him domain over him.
You were fighting so that little twerps like me could do what we want, say what we want.
This is also where we get that other supporting evidence for the reading of Tommy as gay, since he says that Eddie fought fascism so people can love who they want. Eddie is the kind of person he's so proud of having fought against, and Tommy throws that right back in his face. This is legitimately good stuff, and I had to think why it never stood out to me before. And then I remembered it's because the ending completely obliterates its power and meaning and buries those positives in a shallow grave in the woods at the mouth of a cave occupied by an angry bear. But, we'll get to that. Rita comes out, having heard Tommy's accusation that Teddy turned the grandmother in, something that Eddie tries to justify.
She is filthy, a filthy, disgusting thing!
Rita encourages Tommy to go with the doctor and do some good, and closes the door on Eddie. Tommy puts the doctor onto Magpie as the source of all the new televisions in the area, and the trio of Tommy, the doctor, and the detective inspector rush over to the electrical shop. Magpie appears to be out, but the doctor roots around and finds a portable television set of human construction, but alien design. And then his sonic screwdriver finds a signal, and the TVs around him fill up with stolen human faces calling for help, including those of Tommy's grandmother and of Rose. Magpie returns, and the doctor knows he's not the mastermind, prompting the Wire to make herself known. We get a little backstory on her that doesn't really add much of anything, and the Wire starts to feed on the doctor, Tommy, and the detective inspector, all while shouting, And I hope you like that, because shouting either hungry or feed me is almost the entirety of what she's going to do for the rest of the episode, which will never stop annoying me. This villain was chilling for being something well-spoken, articulate, in that particularly archaic way of early television. And in the end, it's all just
Hungry.
And wow! Does that completely drop the ball on what was working about this villain up until now. Eddie's cartoonishness was an issue from almost the very beginning, but it didn't have to be this way for The Wire. And alas, this is what we get. Intimidated by the sonic screwdriver, The Wire stops after only getting the detective inspector's face, leaving a still intact doctor and Tommy to collapse. The Wire transfers to the portable television and orders Magpie to the closest transmitter. The doctor comes to, throws together a technobabble doohickey so he can reverse the polarity of the neutron flow, and gives chase. As the broadcast of the coronation begins, Magpie climbs the tower, plugs in the box, and The Wire begins to feed on all those watching the broadcast. The doctor climbs up to Magpie, who gets obliterated by The Wire, having served his purpose. The doctor plugs in a connection to his doohickey, which initially blows a fuse, but down on the ground, Tommy swaps in a new one, and The Wire's signal retracts. The Wire is deposited on a Betamax tape from the device that the doctor threw together. The people in the homes recover, seemingly unclear on what it was that had happened to them, but delighted to watch the rest of the coronation. All the faceless people are restored, and the doctor plans to be rid of The Wire forever by taping over the cassette. So, we've watched the episode gradually devolve from an intriguing setup with some good atmosphere and a villain with a unique energy to a shoehorned action climax with a villain doing little more than shout "feed me" or "hungry" for the entire third act. And if it all ended there, it would just be a disappointment. Strong start, weak climax. It wouldn't be good, but it wouldn't be a disaster. That describes more than a few episodes, be it Sleep No More, Night Terrors, 42, or The Witchfinders. Just a middle-of-the-road letdown. Except, we're not done yet. We have to resolve the story of the Connollys, and this is where everything goes to absolute hell. Okay, so let's revisit a few scenes so that we can firmly establish two things. Namely, a pattern of abuse and the fact that Eddie was abusive long before this whole mess started. If you were to go by Eddie's first scene alone, you might not see all that much wrong. He's a little gruff, sure, but also has an almost playful moment with his son, and he's not yelling at anybody. This is the downtime. Most abusers aren't at their most monstrous at all times. If there weren't good times for the abuse victims to cling to, more would be likely to leave if it's possible for them to do so. But even within this comparatively calm scene, you can see Eddie making it clear he's not to be questioned. He gives no explanation for where he's going for after dark and just says, "Don't wait up." He says what's what, and that goes unchallenged. There's Tommy's reaction when called back into the house by Eddie.
Get inside now!
Sorry, I better do as he said.
This is the voice of experience. This is not new. This is Tommy knowing what's expected of him by his father from this being an established dynamic. I don't think I've actually seen anybody claim that the stress of the situation has pushed Eddie to be like this, but just in case, I want to nip it in the bud. If this was new, Tommy might have paused. He might have questioned. He might have gone, well, I was just, and then been snapped at again. But he doesn't, because this is just his life. Then there's this line when Eddie is berating Tommy after the boy went to unlock his grandmother's door.
You can forget that college nonsense. You're gonna come and work alongside me. Get your hands dirty for once.
Eddie won't even entertain the idea of his son having a better life than him. A better life? How dare he? What has that little punk ever done to deserve a better life? What has he done that means he gets a shot at college? What? Is he too good to do the work that his old man does? That isn't spoken out loud, but it is extremely evident in the scene nonetheless. If his son wants a better life, well, that means there's something wrong with the life that Eddie has given him. And Eddie will not tolerate that suggestion. This excessive level of control is very, very common in abuse dynamics, and we will see more of it throughout the episode. Eddie does everything he can do to not leave either Tommy or Rita alone to be able to talk to anybody. Even when Tommy and Rita go upstairs with the doctor and Rose to see the grandmother, Eddie, who did not want to go up there before, is there at the back of the group, watching and making sure his family doesn't feel like they are out of his sight and therefore out of his control. And when he thinks that either Rita or Tommy might be getting ideas that they can get out from under him, he promptly stomps that out.
You've had your fun with your little doctor, but now you're left with me, Rita, so you'll behave yourself and smile.
This is a classic abuse tactic, emphasizing the idea that even when his family can get away, they're still under his control in the end, and he will not let them forget that. Immediately following that scene, we also have Eddie belittling Rita in front of everybody else.
I says to Rita, I says, you didn't need to get your hair done special, love. The Queen won't be able to see you.
This is a tactic to use to make abuse victims feel cut off from those they might otherwise seek solace in. How can Rita go to someone for help if she believes that person thinks her a silly little fool of a woman? This is the same scene as the mummy's boy and the threat of beating it out of Tommy, for the record. Now, in regards to what I will grant is we don't see Eddie raise a hand and physically assault either Tommy or Rita. While I very sincerely believe that he would and likely has, I can't prove that. I'd also point out that abuse being verbal and emotional doesn't make it not abuse. And there are many abusers who don't cross the line into physical violence. But we know that at the very least, Eddie is fully comfortable with threatening violence.
Eddie, you want to beat that out of him?
That's exactly what I'm gonna do.
What I do have to give credit for here is that despite being played too cartoonishly for its own good, the depiction of Eddie is ultimately quite true to many abuse dynamics. His controlling and threatening tactics are very in line with many people's reality, and under other circumstances, I might even praise the honesty of that. Unfortunately, how authentic much of this is once you strip off the over-the-top delivery is actually going to end up making the very end of this episode even worse than it already was. And now we're getting to it. Rita hands Eddie a suitcase and points out that the house isn't actually his. It's in her mother's name.
On her behalf, I'm telling you, out.
Eddie takes the suitcase silently, likely realizing that his bellowing isn't going to work this time. Out on the street, the doctor and Rose move among those celebrating the coronation. They settle in next to Tommy as Eddie leaves the house. Tommy, understandably, is happy to see him go. The doctor questions that lightly.
Is that it then, Tommy? New monarch, new age, new world.
Almost like he's setting up Rose to do what she's about to do. Tommy is clearly running on raw anger right now. And yes, that's something he's going to have to find a way to process safely in future. But Rose says,
Tommy, go off then.
And this is where everything nosedives into irredeemability. Tommy rightly asks why he should do that. And Rose's only answer is,
He's your dad.
He's your dad. That's it. Blood relation. The quirk of genetics that means Tommy shares a biological link with the man who's been terrorizing his home for who knows how long, that flimsy genetic connection is given as reason enough to maintain contact with that same abusive man. There is literally no other reason that Rose cites why Tommy should take a single step towards Eddie, except that's not true. She does give another reason, and it's even worse.
Real clever. Clever enough to save the world, so don't stop there.
Oh, for f***'s sake. Rose, all right. Let's be clear with what it is she's saying here. She is saying Tommy saved the world, which he did help do. Granted, it was just changing a fuse, but still, if he hadn't been there to do it, who knows what might have happened. So Tommy saved the world, but he shouldn't stop there. The clear and unavoidable implication being that Tommy should also save Eddie. I'm going to say this as calmly as I can manage. No abuse victim ever, under any circumstances whatsoever, should be told that it is on them to save their abuser. Not only is that a terrible thing to say, it reinforces one of the many faulty thoughts that can keep people in these abusive dynamics. That thought being, but maybe I can fix them. Rose has just instilled into Tommy the idea that he should save his father. And that is liable to be a reason not only to go to Eddie right now, but to also return to him after every single future instance of abuse. This is not okay. This is absolutely f***ed. Now, one of the defenses that I see of this over the years has been about Rose in specific. People have pointed out that her daddy issues, her own feelings of loss about not knowing her father, means that it makes sense for her to do this. And you know what? That's fair. As much as I'd like to think better of Rose and that she'd realize projecting her need for a father onto a monster like Eddie is a massive, massive mistake, it isn't actually out of character for her. I used to blame her as a character specifically for this, but while the words may come out of her mouth, it is in character, and ultimately, she's not the issue. The issue is literally everything else. Everything about the doctor's performance where he lets Rose's words stand like they're good advice and even seems to give her a little, go on then, look, right before she starts in on this. Then there's the shots, the framing, and most crucially and infuriatingly, the hopeful music that underscores this. All of which present this as being a good thing, a sweet thing, a noble thing, and it's f***ing not. It is not a good thing to tell an abuse victim to maintain a connection with their abuser. It's not a good thing to imply that it's in any way the victim's responsibility to save their abuser. It's not a good thing for a man who has been ejected from his home because of his unrepentant behavior to be offered a continued connection with that home before he's even at the end of the block. Now, if you're going to argue that, well, maybe Eddie can get better, I'm not going to dispute that because I can't. That's an unfalsifiable position. Yeah, maybe he can. But I refuse to concede that it's a good idea for one of his victims to maintain contact before that man's had any chance to prove that he's even willing to try and be better. I timed it from when Eddie exits the house to when Tommy, on Rose's suggestion, goes to him. 50 seconds. Not even a full minute has that man been out of the house, and it gets established to him that his son will maintain a connection without him having to do a goddamn thing. If Eddie was ever going to have a prayer at changing, it probably would have been from realizing that his behavior has left him alone and without connection. Except now, it hasn't. He's out of the house, lost his wife, sure. But how bad a guy can he be if his son is still right there with him? This entire thing is bad for literally everybody involved, Eddie included. And to be clear, I will now reiterate the fact that Eddie, being a blood relative, should not be a factor in maintaining a connection at all. I don't care that this is Tommy's father. Being related gives nobody the right to be in somebody's life following abuse. I don't care who it is. Parent, sibling, adult, child. Nobody gets a pass just because they share some DNA. If you wouldn't forgive somebody if they weren't related by blood, then as far as I'm concerned, that's the metric and the end of the discussion. Tommy has every right to cut Eddie fully from his life. And no, but he's acting out of anger, and what if he regrets it later, is not a substantial reason for this entire debacle to be framed as a positive. So what if he does regret it? Would you really look an abuse victim in the eye and say, yeah, they were terrible, but what if you miss them later? And for the record, if your answer is yes, actually I would say that, then kindly fuck off my channel. There is no defense for this. None whatsoever. Now, I don't want to create an illusion that there's no other episode of Doctor Who that has messed up or deeply flawed morals at its core. When it comes to horrible messages, some episodes that I see brought up in conversation with the Idiot's Lantern are Kill the Moon, Arachnids in the UK, and Kerblam. And yes, all of these are pretty bad. Kill the Moon, possibly unintentionally, has a parallel to issues of abortion that feels wildly mishandled. Arachnids in the UK has the Doctor on a moral high horse about shooting giant spiders when she herself still planned to kill them just by different means. And Kerblam botches its entire attempt at capitalist criticism so badly it loops back around and ends up becoming a half-assed defense of it. All three of these could honestly warrant their own scripted deep dives, but I would never place them on par with the Idiot's Lantern. In the case of Kill the Moon, let's say for argument that the abortion allegory is intended, which is something I can't really find concrete information on, for the record. I regularly see people claim that the writer said he didn't intend the metaphor, but nobody ever sources that claim. But regardless, if intended, it's pretty messed up. If we take Clara overriding the desires of the entire Earth and saving rather than destroying the creature within the moon egg as a pro-life stance, well, it's just a horrible analogy because in this case, the destruction of the moon will irreparably damage the planet, if not functionally end it. And the only reason that doesn't happen is somehow magically the newly hatched creature lays a new moon as it leaves, of identical size and mass as the original. So in an episode that sets itself up to be focused on consequences, there are literally none. As an abortion allegory, it would be nonsensical. And if that reading wasn't intended, then there was just a lack of self-reflection to realize what it was they had been created. However, Kill the Moon does at least have that layer of allegory to give it the tiniest bit of distance. It's not much, but it's more than the Idiot's Lantern has. Arachnids in the UK feels very much like an accident, coming across like an early draft that needed revisions to smooth out some bumps, because it remembers that the Doctor doesn't like guns, but for some reason doesn't follow through that train of thought to her not being okay with killing things at all. And at the end, it all comes down to her yelling at somebody for shooting an animal that was going to slowly suffocate anyway, like she is somehow the arbiter of morals in that situation. It's mostly just confused and seems keenly unaware of what it is it's doing. As for Kerblam, What that ultimately does is just muddle everything. It seems to want to criticize capitalism, but doesn't understand it well enough to do so effectively. Its solution to there aren't enough jobs because so much is automated is, well, just require more human workers regardless. And nobody bothers to ask the question, wait, if everything's automated, why are we still requiring people to work in the first place? The whole thing is just confused to hell and back, resulting in moments like this.
We're suspending all operations for a month.
All our workers have been given 2 weeks paid leave.
Closed for a month and only paid for 2 weeks. That just reeks of people not stopping to think about what the words they put down actually indicate. The common thread in all three of these is confusion. Be it confusion about what point they were making, what point they should have been making, or what point they unintentionally ended up making. In all three cases, they either didn't know what point they were trying to make or didn't know how to make it well. By contrast, the Idiot's Lantern very clearly knows what point it's making in those final moments. There's no confusion here. No mixed messages, no scrambled allegories, no other interpretation. There's no wiggle room to presume that this might have happened by accident. The show is clear in its message and believes that it's doing a good thing. It is all right there, plain as day for the audience. A teenage abuse victim has the responsibility of helping his abuser thrust onto him, and everything about the episode frames this as a good and noble thing instead of the absolute abhorrence that it is. Fuck this episode. Always and forever. That's the Idiot's Lantern. That is the worst episode of Doctor Who. And I hope this can be my definitive statement on that. Oh, I'm not saying there won't be other episodes I won't like. I guarantee you there will be. And I'll take them apart as well. But no, I have a hard time believing anything will ever be as bad as this. What are your thoughts on this? Whatever they might be, and including if you think something is genuinely worse, but if you're going to do that, make a case, because I made mine. Drop something down in the comments and let's talk about it. Patreon is what enables me to do this as my living. Even if you can't support me that way, like, share, subscribe, those also help me out. But don't worry too much about it. What I really want you to remember, especially if you found yourself relating to Tommy and his situation in any way, you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council, and I am just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And now to thank my highest supporting patrons: Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfula, Goddess Elida, Oliver B., Melissa Pedersen, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Jean Foray, Ulrich Bogdan, Loki Eris, Linda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Renabulax the Poodle, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperol, Dave Hall, Quite Bearish, Rosalind Bennett, Toku Bluhuvian, Pal Barabajoggle, and Maraji. If you'd like to hear your name in the credits or even just see them, there are rewards on the Patreon, so maybe check those out.